Namaskara, good evening, and welcome to BIC Streams. Bangalore International Center, or BIC for short, is an inclusive, neutral platform for informed conversation, intellectual dialogue, and exchange of ideas, arts, and culture. Today's session on BIC Streams is titled Pegasus and the Deep State, the Global Snooping Pandemic. Project Pegasus, an investigation by 17 global media outlets, suggested widespread and continuing abuse of NSO's hacking spyware, Pegasus, which is sold only to governments. Recently, French intelligence has independently confirmed some of the findings of the Pegasus Project. There has been evidence of its misuse in India. The issue continues to rock the current parliament session, and the Supreme Court is hearing petitions about the use of the spyware. The issue raises questions about privacy, defense, national security, legality, and more, which will be addressed by the panel today. And on the panel, we have Siddharth Varadarajan, founding editor of The Wire, author and journalist Praveen Swami, Apar Gupta, executive director, Internet Freedom Foundation. Our moderator for today is journalist and educator Maya Mirchandani. The full bios of the speakers will appear in the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And throughout the session, if you have any questions, comments, or observations to share with our speakers, please feel free to use the Q&A box. And now, over to Maya.
Thank you so much, Lekha, and to the Bangalore International Center for hosting this conversation. I think the issue of privacy in the digital space is something which has consumed a lot of people's attention now for quite some time. Obviously, Project Pegasus has brought those concerns front and center. You've sort of framed the topic and the introduction to it. So I'm going to actually dive straight into the conversation, which is going to cover themes of privacy, of national security, of individual liberty, of dissent, freedom of expression, many of those issues that we talk about that are kind of embroiled in this conversation. But I want to start with Siddharth Varadarajan, founding editor of The Wire, and one of the 17 global news organizations that were part of this Project Pegasus, which discovered and uncovered the snooping by this software on phones. So Siddharth, apart from whether I should ask you whether your phone is now clean or not, tell us about how you all actually came about working on this project, who approached you, just give us the background.
Yeah, so sometime in March, I was approached by a reporter, a Chennai-based reporter, Sandhya Ravishankar, who'd done a lot of work with us and who I trusted, and who, as it later emerged, had also done some work for Forbidden Stories, although I didn't know it at the time. She reached out to me and said, very cryptically on the phone, that, do you have an iPhone? And I said, yes, I do. And then she said, look, I'd like to come and meet you. And when's a good time for me to fly up from Madras? So I was intrigued, but I said, fine, anytime. I said, I'm locked down, so you can come whenever you like. And it emerged that my colleague MK Venu got a similar call. And so we agreed to meet her on the same day at my place. And she landed up, and essentially, after going through the protocol of making sure our phones were switched off and so on, she said that there was, she had been doing some work for Forbidden Stories, and that they had wanted to get in touch, and that she was playing the role of a go-between. And she then connected us in a secure fashion with a couple of editors from Forbidden Stories, who gave us the news that our phones were most likely targeted with Pegasus, and would we be willing to have them forensically examined. Once we understood what this meant, we consented. And that process took a few hours, during which we were talking. And they said that they had information that there were hundreds of numbers in India that had been targeted, and thousands of numbers around the world. And would the Wire be willing to take part in a global media consortium that they were assembling that would look into the whys and the wheres and the whos of this entire thing. In other words, verifying who these numbers were and just trying to understand what this was all about. So we agreed. We said yes, we would. And then, of course, news came that our phones were also had been compromised. And so that was an added impetus, if you like. But we decided to be part of this project, and for a variety of reasons having to do with the pandemic, the second surge, and difficulties with travel into and out of France, the planning meeting that Forbidden Stories was trying to organize as early as April finally got held only in the first week of May. And we were able to send a colleague for that meeting. And that's where we understood the scope and scale of the project, the kind of database we were looking at. And once we found a way to access these numbers, we then divvied it up. We set up a small team. All of this had to be hush-hush because we didn't want word to leak out that we were working on this kind of a project. It was very clear that the targeting had been done by some kind of government agency. And given that our own phones had been in their radar, this was not something that we wanted to leave to chance, in terms of allowing anything to leak out. So we were quite guarded and careful, developed our own methods of communication, and essentially started working on this in a serious way from, I would say, roughly the middle of May. And the task really was to take these bunch of numbers, because all we had were numbers, +91. The client that we were focused on had a bunch of +91 numbers and a bunch of +92 numbers too. And so we decided that we would focus on the +91s to begin with. And it basically involved using a whole variety of investigative methods to try to understand whose numbers these were, and then to go to the next stage of understanding why they might have been targeted.
Right. So just to follow up on a couple of points that you've raised, Siddharth, one of the things that people who have been sort of critiquing the story have picked up on is that the word potential is used very often when it comes to their potential targets. They were potentially targeted. The client remains unclear. But as we've all deduced that Israel's NSO only sells to government agencies, the assumption is that it is some arm of the government, without knowing necessarily which government. So people are kind of picking up the gaps in the story and trying to say, but where is the conclusive proof? So how do you respond to that?
No, there's no gap in the story at all. We were very clear from the outset that we would present, or we would be as precise as possible in making claims about the database and what it revealed. And the manner in which the numbers emerged and the database emerged, suggested that, or implied, or we knew that these were from clients of NSO. And based on the fact that a number of individuals on this list had been targeted by Pegasus, it was clear that this had something to do with the targeting process for Pegasus. But we were very clear that unless we could actually get forensic evidence from somebody's instrument, we would not make a positive claim that they had been infected with Pegasus. Right? So in other words, so we had a list of potential or probable targets, and I'll tell you how I distinguish between a potential and a probable. But essentially, you have this list of a wider set of numbers or targets, and then you have a smaller set of people whose phones showed positive forensic evidence of Pegasus activity or definite attempts to infect the phone with Pegasus. So even among the phones that we tested, or which tested positive, we distinguished between those where the infection was successful and those where the infection may have been successful, but we didn't have evidence of that. But we had evidence of an attempted infection. So the way that our methodology, the way we worked was that we started with, as I said, 1,000+ numbers, +91 numbers. We tried to identify the owners of as many of these as we could, and came to a working list of around 300. And then we worked out, okay, how many of these 300 can we approach to ask that they allow us to do forensics on their phone? The risk here was that somebody may go running to the government, somebody may go running to social media. So we had to be careful in whom we approached, but we finally drilled down to around 40, 50 people whom we asked. and roughly in the first, we've now done around 20, I would say 23 or 24 examinations of phones. So we did tests on around 24 phones, and we found, I think the current count is 13 phones that show evidence of Pegasus. I think 8 are full-blown infections and 5 are attempted infections. And the full-blown infections include the politician Prashant Kishore, a bunch of journalists, S.A.R. Gilani, the late S.A.R. Gilani, Bilal Lone in Kashmir, I think is one of them. There's a Punjab lawyer, a human rights lawyer, etc. Right? So in our presentation, we have, made a distinction between confirmed infections and probable or potential infections. And the distinction that I would make is that if one person, like say Rahul Gandhi, right? So Rahul Gandhi has 2 of his numbers on the list, then 2 of his office associates, and 5 of his friends. So when you have 8 or 9 numbers associated with one person, right? Or say the minister, Prahlad Singh Patel, we found 18 numbers linked to him. Or the young woman who complained of sexual harassment by Ranjan Gogoi. We found, I believe, 11 numbers linked to her and her husband and her relatives. This made it quite clear that her appearance was not happenstance. Like Ashwini Vaishnav on the floor of the House kind of presented NSO's explanation that these numbers could have been used for some other purpose and so on and so forth. But when you have 11 numbers linked to one person, it becomes clear that they are with a high degree of certainty that they are probable targets of Pegasus. In all likelihood, they must have been successfully targeted as well, but because their phones are not available, or because they are Android phones, which are much harder to read in terms of the data logs, we were careful in what we said, right? So in a funny sort of way, the precise, our decision to be responsible and be very precise and make only those claims which we can authenticate. The government initially tried to make that into, to hold that against us and to say, well, all of this is not valid. But I think that whole debate is now over for the simple reason that you have the government of France, which reacted on the basis of the potential targeting of Emmanuel Macron, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So they didn't, there was no forensic test done on the president. His status on the list, as far as our database is concerned, is exactly the same as that of Rahul Gandhi, or of Ashok Lavasa, or of Prahlad Singh Patel, or indeed of Mr. Ashwini Vaishnav, right? Yet the French government added 2 and 2 together. They said, well, this number is on a list of other people whose phones have shown, positive traces of Pegasus. And in France, the numbers are roughly the same. I think they found 8 or 9 full-blown infections and around 5 or 6 targeted infections. So the French government, within 24 hours, said, we are announcing a probe. They got on the phone to speak to Naftali Bennett in Israel. The Israelis cracked the whip. We don't know how sincerely. Maybe Praveen can shed light on that. But they go through the motion of cracking the whip. There's a so-called raid done on NSO. NSO itself, dons its version of sackcloth and ashes and says, well, we don't approve the way in which if journalists have been targeted and we're going to investigate. And the Israelis set up so you have all of this activity on the basis of a list of probable targets, right? So this defense by Mr. Vaishnav or anybody in government that, oh, this is only a probable list. We don't know whether snooping has happened or not. We don't know about the authenticity of this. It's all unconfirmed. All of that goes out of the window when you compare the behavior of a responsible government like France with that of our government. And this is quite apart from the fact that we have concrete evidence of actual infected phones. And one other element, Maya, in 2019, WhatsApp wrote to the government of India saying that 121 phones were, targeted by Pegasus, and they mentioned that the data of 20 Indians had been stolen or compromised. And 19 of those 20, I believe, wrote to the government. And I think some of them even spoke before the standing committee on IT. So there is no secret about, and Ravi Shankar Prasad, as IT minister, actually acknowledges on the floor of the House that WhatsApp told us about this. So there is no, and many of those numbers like the 19 people whose names are in the letter that they wrote to the government of India, are all on our database. And they appear in our database in precise, we're doing another story on this, but this will be part of a global, we're correlating data from other countries where you had WhatsApp targets, right? But I can say that the Indian WhatsApp targets, who WhatsApp had told the government were targeted between a 10 or 12-day window in April to May 2019. That is also the time in our database when these numbers appear to have shown Pegasus-related activity. So there's a high correlation between the timestamps and dates in our data and the claims that WhatsApp made to the government of India, which the government of India has not contested. And I mean, they haven't acted on it, which is a different matter. But the government of India has not contested WhatsApp's claim, right? So any which way you look at it, look at the reaction of other governments, look at the reality of the forensic tests, look at the reality of the WhatsApp data, and final point, that the government of India itself, despite being given ample opportunity to do so, has never denied that they have bought Pegasus, right? So they've been asked repeatedly, have you bought Pegasus? Government will not say on the record. And yesterday, while I was just reviewing what the government has told us since we began working on this project, the penny dropped on another small matter, which I don't think is small, but let me share it with your viewers. We wrote to the government, to the PMO on, I believe, July 14th or 15th, saying that we have information that a client of NSO that we believe is an Indian government agency has targeted XYZ individuals. And we named various people, Rahul Gandhi and so on and so forth. We get a response from not the PMO, but from MeitY, from the Ministry of Electronics, Information Technology. It's an unsigned letter. It's an unsigned note, which says that government of India denies targeting any of the specific individuals that you have mentioned. I forget the precise wording, but this is what they say.
Yeah.
Now, when Ashwini Vaishnav goes to the floor of the House, he had the option of repeating that line, that categorical denial, which is there in this unsigned statement from his ministry. So he could have added a lot of punch to what he said on the floor of the House, Mr. Vaishnav, if he had simply read that line, but he didn't do that. Yeah. And the reason he didn't do that, and the reason why it's unsigned, is probably because the claim is false and known to be false. And if you do that on the floor of the House, then there are all kinds of other legal consequences that he perhaps didn't want to deal with.
That's right. That's a fair point. But let me bring Praveen in from that point, because Praveen, the list of numbers and the list of journalists and activists, the names that came about, I mean, there is an argument that many people in the national security establishment all over the world make in favor of surveillance. I mean, it's a tool to ensure that citizens are safe, terrorists are not able to plot attacks, etc., etc. But it's evident from the names that have come out as targets of potential hacking that these are not people who were by any way national security threats. And that brings into question this whole idea of state involvement, the deep state misusing certain privileges it gets in the name of national security to actually spy on citizens. I think that's really the heart of the issue.
Absolutely. Siddharth mentioned that a number of the numbers on the list that they have are 9-2 numbers, Pakistani numbers. It's one thing for a nation state to carry out espionage overseas, 9-2 numbers, or for that matter, 8-6 numbers in China or wherever. In fact, even Emmanuel Macron's phone, arguably assuming that the Moroccan government did it, it's a bit hypocritical for France or for any Western country to complain about this, because of course Western governments routinely do this. There's the Five Eyes Alliance of the English-speaking democracies led by the United States, who routinely conduct activities on a global scale. Where there is a problem here, and a very, very serious problem, is in the use of these assets against Indian citizens. And at the first stage, I'd say, irrespective of whether they are criminals or journalists or anyone else. And this is because when you conduct what's called lawful interception of communications, whether that's email or whether that's phone communication, you do so through a lawful process. So the United States has laws which, for example, criminalize or make it impossible for their intelligence servants to surveil American citizens without some sort of process of law. Many countries have similar legislation, including the French. Unfortunately, in India, the laws are extremely sort of vague and poorly worded. Two, there's no credible oversight mechanism. So the decision is not a judicial one made by the Secretary of India or by the chief secretaries of various states, and there's no sort of real oversight over what goes on. And thirdly, and most importantly, as this case shows, a lot of the effort seems to be targeting political opponents of the government or journalists in the pursuit of information that by no stretch of the imagination can be said to have any national security relevance of any kind. Now, unfortunately, in India, many people in the audience here will know far better than I do. There's a sort of fairly sordid history of this dating to the emergency and behind. Even the LP Singh committee that was set up to look at the Intelligence Bureau, some of what it got up to during the emergency, kind of ducked the question on oversight and on lawful governance of the intelligence services. And we've had scandal after scandal afterwards with the proliferation of technology. More worryingly, this hasn't remained just something the Intelligence Bureau does, but we've had cases of state governments, for example, involving themselves in mobile phone interception and so on, targeting figures, again, of no sort of law enforcement or national security relevance, and some cases where private sector entities are believed to have engaged in this kind of activity. Now, this is, of course, a threat to everyone's privacy, and it's also fraught with various implications for our democracy, for the functioning of our institutions, with blackmail targeting individuals, with a bunch of fairly awful outcomes. Now, for a number of years, as you know, there have been people within the intelligence services and from outside them calling for reforms around this, calling for legislative oversight of the intelligence services. Sadly, Manish Tiwari, the former union minister who'd introduced a private members bill, got nowhere. In fact, his own party wasn't particularly interested in pursuing that matter, let alone the one we have in power right now. And I hope this is a wake-up call for people to start taking this seriously, because given the amount of data and information now most of us quite routinely upload or use the internet for, this is something that poses a real and I think present threat to many more of us than surveillance ever in the past has. I mean, once upon a time, there was a limit to how much even the Intelligence Bureau could listen to, given our clunky phone system. Today, the possibilities for gathering vast amounts of data and for its misuse is terrifying.
Yeah, I'll come back to that point and the government's response or lack of response in just a couple of minutes. But Apar, let me bring you in, because Praveen has given us a good segue actually to talk about this issue of legislative oversight as one. But we heard a lot of people, and there seems to be a stomach for this, to say, oh, well, we sign over all kinds of information and consent agreements when we download apps, or we use Amazon, or we buy things in an online space, or the idea, or we give our biometrics when we want to travel abroad. That's another favorite one that comes up all the time. But what does it take to actually tell people that what you are doing willfully for maybe commercial purposes versus what the state is doing without your knowledge or your consent, assuming it's the state, are two entirely different things. And by this kind of justification, you're actually creating room for more of this to perpetuate.
Thank you so much. I think this question comes up quite often because we've also been conducting some public advocacy around the Pegasus issue. And the common response is not that we don't care about our privacy. It is quite often now, because people are much more educated about what is the personal data being used in their phone, being shared by large Silicon Valley platforms, is to say, but why you are not also criticizing the large Silicon Valley platforms? And I think the way to deal with this is firstly to recognize that even this query at its very root arises out of a sense of privacy nihilism, which is essentially an argument which is quite often made to deny the very right of privacy itself. The first element of this, which is important to understand, is that data protection laws, which are right now in the oven and have been for a long time, will actually take care of consensual sharing of information with platforms, and there is a market failure there. Large platforms gather our data because they want to keep us on those platforms for longer periods of time, so more data can be gathered. Or sometimes they seek permissions for excessive information which they gather through our smartphones. The purpose is commercial. However, even for this kind of gathering, if we look at the transparency reports of, let's say, YouTube, or we look at Apple, or we look at Google or Facebook or Twitter, India ranks amongst the top 3 nations in terms of requests for user information. So even if your information is being shared by Silicon Valley platforms or the services you're using, quite often through imperfect mechanisms of long terms of service, which no one reads, is clearly a market failure, in which you don't know what information is being gathered. That is a problem, and that can be fixed by a data protection bill. And in fact, even the present data protection bill, for all the criticisms, and there are many, there are plenty, is that they still bring in a regulatory framework to address this, in which there will be a data protection authority, there will be clear legal safeguards, and there will be monetary fines and penalties placed on platforms when they do not give sufficient notice or exceed the bound of permission which is given to them by ordinary users. However, to juxtapose this or to jumble this with the larger issue of surveillance, in which information is gathered without the consent and knowledge of a person, is a bit much more troubling. And I'll just come to this why. Because the provisions for surveillance and interception, which are there, first under the Telegraph Act under Section 5(2), or under the Information Technology Act under Section 69, and then the process which is made under it is firstly made keeping in mind interception which was done on analog telephones. It flows out of safeguards which were there in the telephone tapping judgment, as it is called by lawyers like me, in 1996 by the Supreme Court. And essentially what it does, and just to build off what Praveen was saying, was place excessive executive authority and power which is centralized without any oversight of Parliament or a prior sanction from the judiciary. So essentially, imagine, Maya, that the authority which is issuing the order is also the authority which is investigating the offense, and is also the authority which is placed as a safeguard to review this entire process. And you can look at Rule 419A of the Telegraph Rules or the interception rules made in 2009. And the second problem, which I'll also say, is that surveillance quite often, which is now being done through Pegasus, for instance, is beyond the ordinary surveillance, which is also done by Silicon Valley platforms. Just look at the product functionality of Pegasus. It gives root access to your phone, which theoretically means that not only does it intercept, it can also insert files potentially into that compromised device.
Yeah, in fact, the idea of inserting files is something that has created a fair amount of alarm, because there is already a case in which the government has been, or law enforcement has been accused of injecting files into those they have the computers of those they have detained. So that, let me just come back to you very quickly. The Ministry of Defense has actually stated on record that they are not clients of Pegasus and they have not bought Pegasus from the NSO. Many people are seeing this as a, not just the Ministry of Defense saying it, but a larger, sort of note from the government per se that, oh, look, the Indian government is saying that they are not, not making the distinction that the Ministry of Defense may be just one entity amongst many that belong to the government that could be clients.
Well, I mean, the proof of this whole, I mean, this matter could have been very easily resolved if the government had answered the question which was selected for reply by a CPI MP, I think Binoy Vishwam, in the Rajya Sabha, which asked a simple question: that has the government of India bought a license to use Pegasus from NSO? And informally, he was told that even though your question has been admitted, we perhaps can't answer it because it's sub judice, the matter is before the Supreme Court. But then, lo and behold, you have another question on the, so if this matter is sub judice, then how did the MODs answer? Why was that allowed, right? So it's clear that the government wants to avoid answering a direct question, because the question to ask is not, has MOD bought, or has RAW bought, or has NTRO bought? The question is, has the government of India
bought right.
Pegasus, right? And it's a simple question that can be answered with a yes or a no. So I wouldn't take the MOD's reply, as signifying anything other than the Defense Ministry is saying that we haven't bought it. And there are, in any case, the needle of suspicion based on Citizen Labs analysis of DNS cache, from servers that NSO is using. Zeros, the finger points. I mean, NSO has told us on the record. Sorry, Citizen Lab has told us on the record. Now, for those of your viewers who don't know Citizen Lab, this is a very highly rated and credible, security, forensic security setup at the University of Toronto. They are the ones who worked with WhatsApp to uncover the 2019 Pegasus infections. So Citizen Labs people have told us on the record that based on their analysis of activity, DNS cache activity, they have zeroed in on 2 clients in India. One client spies on numbers in India and abroad, and the other client spies on numbers exclusively in India. Now, I know that the remit of IB and RAW is mixed in the sense that IB they do a lot of duplication. But essentially, the fact is that we have a bunch of numbers in India. We have a bunch of numbers +92 Pakistan numbers. And it would seem to me, based on the way in which government gathers intelligence, that these are the 2 agencies most likely to be using it. We have noticed when we analyze the data that even though the database stretches for a longer period, we have numbers, for example, from Mexico or from Morocco that that go back as early as 2016, perhaps even 2015. But all the India numbers start in the middle of 2017. And the Pakistan numbers are added a little bit later, but all the +91 numbers that this client has selected for actual or probable surveillance, this activity starts from the middle of 2019, around about the time that Mr. Doval and Mr. Modi visit Israel. So it's possible that that's when an agreement to use Pegasus was formally signed. I have no doubt that a written contract exists in the innards of Government of India in a file somewhere. And if the Supreme Court were to demand from the Home Secretary, Cabinet Secretary, DIB, and Secretary R in 2017 and today, I think we're talking roughly of 5 or 6 gentlemen, right? Rajiv Maharishi, Rajiv Gauba, Anil Dasmana, etc. Rajiv Jain, ask them to submit an affidavit in the Supreme Court on a personal affidavit that they have no knowledge of the use of Pegasus. Nobody's asking them to disclose anything that would compromise a terror investigation, right? Which is potential legitimate use. Even when we analyze the numbers, we consciously avoided giving any detail of things that, as Praveen says, would represent espionage, quote unquote legitimate espionage, right? We said, fine, we're not going to touch that. We're not going to look at 9-2 numbers. We're not going to look at, there were some diplomatic numbers that were probably selected for espionage reasons. We said we're not going to touch them. on the logic that no journalist, like any of us who gets hold of a list of embassies where a bug has been planted. I mean, that's not a story, right? You're not going to report that. So, but we saw that the use of this technology against people in India, given the kind of individuals who were involved, was illegitimate. It was illegal. It was evil, and to my mind, actually represents a case of political corruption in the electoral sense, right? You're using an asset paid for by the taxpayers' money, so it's public money used to acquire a surveillance method, which you're then deploying for personal political gain, right? So when you target Prashant Kishore in the middle of an election campaign, this is, to my mind, an act of electoral corruption and malpractice that is many times more serious than what Indira Gandhi was pulled up for by the Allahabad High Court in 1975, right? This is something far more serious than that. And so for these reasons, we said that this is manifestly in the public interest to publish this information. And I'm hoping that pressure will be brought to bear on the government to come clean with this, because the strategy of ducking and hiding and pretending that this problem doesn't exist, or laughably, as Mr. Amit Shah said, that this is all about, this is a plot to malign the Modi government and to disrupt the monsoon session. I mean, for heaven's sake, we're talking of 17 media organizations analyzing numbers in Mexico, in Hungary, in Morocco, in Belgium, in France, and India, deciding on a publication date months in advance. And Mr. Shah, the whole thing is about tarnishing the Modi government. So that's not how it works, right? And so essentially the government has to give us information on this.
So Praveen, let me ask you that, because what Siddharth is saying sounds like a reasonable enough sort of comment, and to say that, all right, all these people who were heading these agencies in the time period in question, say that whether they were or not, were they clients, or did they authorize the purchase, or did they not? And yet these are some of the country's topmost security agencies. So these are people who headed those. So is there a likely scenario that they would even would they be put under pressure to write such a note?
I'm not an astrologer, and I don't know what the Supreme Court's going to do. I mean, we all know some of this, is a little bit of the roll of the dice. But regrettably, the courts have been historically extremely reluctant to step in where matters of the intelligence services have been involved. Now, personally, would I like to see thoroughgoing disclosure on this? Absolutely. And that's because, as someone who writes about national security and who spends a lot of time doing this stuff, it's become clear to me over the years that the status quo is in fact not just bad for citizens at the wrong end of a government, so to speak, but bad for the country as a whole and bad for the intelligence services. And here's why. The first reason is that this, and I think, again, some people in this room know this, but particularly the Intelligence Bureau spends a great deal of time doing things that can't credibly be described to have a national security function. It examines elections, it examines the state of play in political parties, it looks at the economy, they even look at things like food security. And some of the genesis of this is in the pre-independence period, when, of course, the British didn't have well-developed institutions to do some of this kind of monitoring, and it fell into the realm of broadly the intelligence basket of state functions. But it also has to do with the fact that politicians have learned that there's few things as juicy and helpful as listening to someone's phone. And over the years, this has created a lot of perverse incentives where if the heads of the intelligence services believe that the prospects of appointment or promotion or future prospects post-retirement are contingent on their closeness to the politicians and to what they can deliver as political actors, then they're going to spend more and more time and resources doing it. And the time and resources that are spent doing it are time and resources that don't go into genuine national security functions, on which we are actually quite anemic. As I said, it's interesting to note that the Moroccans have spent an awful lot of time spying on the French. We have spent a good deal of time spying on our own citizens. And that to me is a real sort of problem. I hope that there will be an investigation on this and a pinning of responsibility. And I hope that someday we will have politicians who realize that this does not serve the interests of the political system. It doesn't serve the interests of the country. Because ultimately, intelligence services that are not credible, that don't do intelligence gathering effectively, leave the country vulnerable to all kinds of threats. I've heard it said, as you mentioned earlier in your thing, that look, where is the conclusive evidence? And of course, the conclusive evidence comes when you transparently investigate these things and the courts hear them. And I can only hope that this is the wake-up call where some of this starts happening. Do I personally think that's going to happen? We've had enough wake-up calls and not woken up. So, I honestly, I don't know.
Yeah. So Apar, let me ask you, I mean, it's not about looking into a crystal ball, but it's about looking at, past precedents as well, when the courts have had to step in or possibly adjudicate, make a statement, observation on issues of national security. Where do you think this will go in the courts? Because, I mean, once you have the IB and RAW and NTRO and all these other various agencies, the courts have in the past got very nervous in taking them on. That's the truth.
Maya, I think this is something which may also deal with the pending court case right now, and I will avoid comment on that just to clarify. But going by past precedent, it's correct in terms of national security and individual liberty. When they are placed together, it's quite often, and if you think about them as an adversarial contest, it's national security which is always given a preference, sometimes even beyond the constitutional framework. So you can look at cases like Kharak Singh, which looks at the constitutionality of the Tada law. Okay, the court for a long period in the judgment comments on the virtues of individual liberty, but does not strike down the law, but only inserts certain features within it which make it much more reasonable to administer. There is a long list of precedent also with respect to telephone tapping. Now, for instance, if you look at the PUCL case, which gave the safeguards, it also emerged from a scandal in which there was a disclosure in a magazine of politicians tapping others. And that led to this case being filed by PUCL. What the court discovers in 1996 is fairly shocking. It says the power exists under the Telegraph Act, but you have not made any process or procedure for implementation of the power. So even the safeguards we are looking at in terms of the Home Secretary issuing these orders, they are fairly recent in terms of a documented process as per law. So we've been fairly laggard on this. The second reason I'll say that let's also look beyond the courts to the larger institutional response to this. What's been our parliamentary response to this? This also unearths a reference to two elements of this problem. The first element essentially deals with the regulation and the statutory recognition of intelligence agencies. We don't even have a law which deals with the creation, the operation, the financial outlays, and the oversight by Parliament on the intelligence agencies. Sure, we can have a debate whether that serves national security or not. Does that undermine it? But we have not even reached the point of that debate. The second part is, what are the powers when exercised by them in terms of surveillance? And in terms of this, I'd like to just indicate what has been the parliamentary response and what have been the efforts by the government. There was a prior version of the data protection law, which was much broader, which was called the Privacy Bill, which was taken up by UPA 1, which was led by the Department of Personnel and Training, right? And you can look at news reports till about 2015. It's somehow being deliberated again and again. There were 3 versions of it which were leaked to the public. There were no public consultations. And all the press reports essentially indicate that the intelligence agencies as well as the Home Ministry bureaucracy is opposing a legal mechanism for even disclosing what it's doing. In fact, I myself have filed a RTI, and it's presently in appeal before the Home Ministry, and it's even refusing to provide statistical information with regard to how many telephone tapping orders or interception orders are issued by it in aggregate over each year. And its latest responses, it just does not keep the records itself. Now, this shows that not only are we looking at a response which can come through the Supreme Court in terms of these pending PILs, the inquiry commission which has been set up in West Bengal under Justice Madan Lokur, the one promised in Chhattisgarh, which we don't know, does it exist or does not exist, one which was promised sometimes in Maharashtra and did not even come to be beyond the statement made by the Minister for State there, or the parliamentary response. The core sense which I get, and I think which people should take away from, is that there is a undue amount of reverence we give to national security without testing it for evidence. And the second is these forces with regard to these inbuilt biases in our state systems, whether it may be the judicial framework or it may be the legislative framework, has always leaned towards national security rather than individual liberty. So it's a tough road ahead. And I think that more accountability needs to be demanded by people.
So Praveen, come back in on that, because, you know, the question of accountability, especially in the national security apparatus, some oversight, some accountability. I mean, sure, there are sensitive cases and sensitive bits of information and things like that that may be covered under official secrets. But broadly, I mean, you cannot have institutions that are meant to protect and preserve national security in the country that operate without any kind of oversight whatsoever. Legislative oversight, you know, executive oversight, so that's a different matter altogether, or from the judiciary. So, I mean, if you have a structure where they're not answerable to anyone, for least of all the taxpayer on whose money that they are doing all this, you know, we can go back into history and say, well, that it hasn't been done in the past, but we're looking at a road ahead right now for something like this. Also in a space and in a time when technology is moving at a much faster pace than we can even attempt to catch up with. So how do we find this balance?
You know, the classic answer you'll get on this intelligence reform debate from its opponents in the intelligence services and the Home Ministry is, oh, this is India, you can't trust these politicians to, you know, deal with these national security matters. Look at them, half of them are criminals. And this is a remarkably silly argument for a couple of reasons, in my opinion. And the first reason is, of course, you do trust these politicians. They are your ministers. You report to them. You conduct surveillance on their political adversaries on their say-so. So you can't say that, oh, you know, anyone who happens to be a minister is a wise statesman-like figure, but anyone in a oversight committee is some criminal who can't be trusted with these things. After all, politicians have known the secrets of our nuclear program and missile program. You know, these are by contrast, presumably matters the political system can keep secrets on. The second and more sort of, I think, significant reason that this is opposed is that the status quo is a comfortable one. On the one hand, politicians can get their dirty work done by the intelligence services. And on the other, the intelligence services have no accountability. So in any self-respecting country, say after 26/11 or after the various debacles that you have had, heads would have rolled. Of course, nothing happened here. And that's the flip side of this sort of quite cozy arrangement that the politicians don't go after the intelligence community when things go wrong. And all of this has retarded reform. Now, in my view, you're not going to have, you know, any meaningful progress coming out of people with a vested interest in the status quo. But the intelligence community, especially retired people, should be asking themselves some tough questions about where this heads up. So you had huge scandals in the United States in the 60s, which led to the Church Committee investigations. You've had big scandals in the UK, in France, which led to reforms over there. And each of those scandals, when this happy quid pro quo eventually exploded, imposed terrible costs on the intelligence community, which were felt for years and decades after those events in those countries. And if I was someone in the intelligence community who cared about those services, I would be asking myself whether I wanted to add myself to voices in the services who are already calling for reform and preempting that kind of scandal and crisis, or whether I want to sit on the sidelines and basically watch the work of my lifetime undone. Because, Pegasus might not be the time that this great scandal happens and the pillars of the world crumble down on the intelligence community's head. But I think it's safe to say that day will come. Like I said, if I was in that position, I would be thinking very, very hard about these questions.
Siddharth, there seems to be, the sense of invincibility that our national security apparatus has, and impunity, not just invincibility, but also impunity. And that ties into, Praveen is saying that they should get ahead of this and start talking about reform, start having this conversation. But right now, there's a very simple question. I think one of our viewers has actually asked that as well. We're looking at, as you said, what France is doing, right? It's a simple thing. The government is taking note of the fact that these numbers or certain numbers may have been infected with spyware. And these are people who should not have been targeted by spyware at all. Just that action by a foreign government, do you think it will have any repercussions, leave alone the impunity of the national security apparatus? I'm talking about even a political response.
Yeah. So, without beating around the bush, it's very clear that what allows the French government to be transparent in this case is that its nationals have been targeted by, obviously, the actions of a foreign government, right? So it's politically relatively easy for Macron to order this investigation. It's possible, given the political landscape in France, that if evidence were to emerge that the French government had targeted individuals in France, that his hand might still have been forced. But the reason why Modi will not want to follow what France has done, and the reason why Modi has not demanded answers from the Israeli government or from NSO, is because he knows who has drawn up this list of targets, right? So Macron, it's logical for Macron to want confirmation from the Israelis that before he has a huge dust up with the Moroccans, that
Right.
that please confirm this. And incidentally, Praveen spoke about the there's a lot of a lot of intelligence work is essential and genuine and painstaking, and people devote their lives to it. And all of that gets jeopardized when you use these tools for illegitimate purposes. And in the case of Morocco is fascinating, right? Because France and Morocco actually have a very close security relationship. They have active intelligence cooperation on dealing with Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all its offshoots. And I think France and Morocco may suffer if they are not able to use surveillance against genuine bad guys, right? But in misusing this toy to target journalists and all kinds of other people, you make it that much more difficult for anybody to accept the legitimacy of using Pegasus against bad people, right? And the same thing is going to happen here if there is a discussion, and which is why I say that politicians who masquerade as great defenders of national security are actually doing a great deal of damage to national security. Those who claim to be defenders of the intelligence community are actually undermining it by pushing the IC into doing this kind of dirty political work. And what is this work, right? Why on earth would you want to eavesdrop on the telephones of the young woman who filed a complaint against Ranjan Gogoi. The only reason I can think of, and this is a pretty shitty reason, is that you want to learn the full extent of what she knows, and perhaps use that information as leverage against Mr. Gogoi or against somebody else. And that cannot be a legitimate pursuit of the IB or RAW or of intelligence, of supposedly a counter-terrorism tool, right? So I have no expectation that the government by themselves will ever be able to admit to using Pegasus in the first place, because even without going into the target list, and Apar can back me up on this, there's a good argument to be made that the use of Pegasus per se would be illegal in India because it involves the act of hacking, for which the way the IT law is drafted, you never created a carve out. So whether you do it for good reasons or bad, hacking is an offense. So that's one reason why they can never admit to owning and using Pegasus. But even if they were to bring themselves to do that, they would not be able to admit to actually using Pegasus against the people that we've identified. And they will resort to all kinds of subterfuge in order to avoid making a definitive statement on this, either in court or parliament. Because don't forget, I have proof of Pegasus on my phone. MK Venu, Sushant Singh, Prashant Kishore, we all have evidence of this, right? And this is evidence of which, my confidence level in this evidence is enough to that Venu, me, Sushant, we are part of a case that RSF has brought in Paris against NSO. And so there is this evidence which the government will have to find some way of explaining. So unless the government is compelled to do so, and frankly, the only authority in India that can do that is the Supreme Court. Unless the courts were to compel the government to complete. And as I want to underline again that there is no reason why any genuine national security application of Pegasus would be jeopardized by compelling the government to come clean on the reality of what we've reported, right? But the government is going to fight this tooth and nail, and but it's very, very important for the integrity of India's democratic process. So this is not just about the integrity of the intelligence services. This is not just about my privacy or your privacy. This is not just about those kinds of concerns which are important, but this is about the use of public money to skew the political playing field in favor of the ruling party, right? I'm reminded of Indira Gandhi 1975. I'm reminded of Nixon 1972. This is the scale of what we are looking at here in terms of political corruption. And it has nothing to do with national security, but only the court can compel the government to provide the information that it has.
The court, in fact, has also sort of issued an order, I guess, Apart, correct me if I'm wrong, if that's the right terminology for it, to say that there should not be any parallel debates or parallel conversations on this. Siddharth, what do you understand by that?
No, I don't. That's not. If you understand the context of the Chief Justice's comment, it's very clear what he meant. He asked a question in open court in the last hearing, based on what is now evident, a misreading of Mr. N. Ram's petition, right? And based on that misreading, Kapil Sibal gave an answer of a certain kind, which trolls on social media, all of whom are linked to the ruling party incidentally, then seized upon to try to present Mr. Ram as a liar and to suggest that the court had pulled him up for lying, which the court hadn't done. So Ram was compelled to say that, look, we never said this. And I suppose the Chief Justice and his colleagues found this entire discussion a little bit unedifying. The fact is that Mr. Ram was compelled to defend himself, but he did so with grace. He did not level an allegation against anybody. But the fact is that because some mischief mongers on social media tried to distort or derive meaning from what the Chief Justice had said, that was clearly not intended. I think this is what upset the bench. Rather than the kind of discussion that we are having. I don't think the court even remotely tried to suggest that there should be no debate or discussion on this. But I think what they don't like is when people put words in the mouth of judges, or when people distort what happened in court or present it in a sort of skewed way. I think that's what they have objected to, and I think quite rightly so.
Right. I mean, this actually, Siddharth, if you think about it, the Pegasus story, I mean, the point that you're making about political corruption and the scale of political corruption that we're actually considering over here, it brings us to the sort of larger landscape and atmosphere that we're all operating in as journalists, as writers, as lawyers, which is the awareness and the reality that the state, Pegasus or no Pegasus, that we're dealing with a state that is willing to use whatever tools it has at its disposal to stifle dissent, criticism. I mean, Disha Ravi happened at a time when the Pegasus story was nowhere on the horizon, for example, right? And yet you saw the kind of actions that were taken against a 21-year-old climate activist because they found a document on her Google Drive. So I'm just saying, it doesn't have to be the scale of Pegasus to understand the kind of situation we're all in, I suppose, right?
I mean, since Praveen and I are both journalists, we should be forgiven for seeing the targeting of journalists as part of this horrible continuum that you mentioned. That there has been action at various levels: legal, extra-legal, illegal, pressure brought to bear on reporters and journalists, editors, media publications, on a vast variety of pretexts, right? It used to be, back in the bad old days, that the only occupational hazard that a reporter or an editor had to deal with was, a defamation case, right? So either civil or criminal, that was one means used to target journalists. Then we've seen the onset of physical violence, assassinations. Gauri Lankesh in your city, in BIC, in Bangalore, shot dead. Example of an editor, outspoken editor, targeted for her views, and foot dragging. It took a change of government for the investigation to reach a certain stage. Even now, I'm not sure what the status of the trial is. And you have other examples. Shujat, our friend and colleague, Shujat Bukhari in Kashmir, being assassinated. We still don't know who the person, who his killers were. Threats against reporters in Manipur, in Chhattisgarh, absurd grounds on which people so there's a television journalist in Manipur who I believe is still in jail under the National Security Act for simply posting on Facebook that cow urine and cow dung will not cure you of COVID. It boggles the mind that India allows laws of this kind to be used against anybody, let alone journalists, right? So, but now they've added criminal cases for reporting, and Pegasus is the latest weapon, and you can only imagine the damage this does, right? If you're going to, and the reason for using Pegasus against a reporter is to ensure that certain kinds of stories either don't get done, or if they are being worked upon, that the government has a heads up on that. And I want to caution any journalist watching this story, watching this show, that please don't imagine, and we have been very careful not to suggest from day one, that the list of 40 that we mentioned is an exhaustive list. This is one set of names that have emerged from one database, which itself represents one vector of surveillance over a 2.5 year period. So the actual number of journalists who are under watch in one way or the other is probably much larger. But we have to do our work, and the same, I suppose, applies to people who are in politics, people who are in civil society. We have examples of businessmen being targeted on our database, lawyers, all kinds of people. I suppose these are occupational hazards, but in a democracy, it shouldn't have to be so. And I think this is important that we say that, look, this is not acceptable, that you can't, and if you're going to constrain journalists in this way, then you are actually attacking Indian democracy, because journalists are the ones who are meant to be asking those questions and reporting those stories which educate voters.
Right. Somebody I worked with actually received a document, a 2-3 page document. This was sometime in the midst of the second wave while, we were tweeting vociferously against what was going on, with sort of colored markers of blue, red, yellow, highlighting what tweets I had composed myself, what I had retweeted, or what I had quote tweeted. And it was sent as a document. I was quite alarmed, but they sent it to me and said, we just want you to know that somebody is watching what you're doing. And so I said, they clearly have a lot of time using all these various colored felt pens, but that's a separate story altogether. Apart the point that Siddharth was making about hacking and the fact that the government will never actually be able to admit, or you probably will not be able to admit, because hacking itself is illegal per se. So the government will have to then admit that it has committed an illegal act on its own. Just explain that a little bit for everyone watching.
The first thing I want to also deal with, Maya, possibly because it's a question floating in several people's head, is that why didn't the people who have been hacked go and register an FIR, right?
Right.
And quite often people say, Apar, if you're saying that this is a crime, why doesn't anybody go to the Delhi police, possibly, file a complaint and register a FIR? Well, the answer to this is, firstly, if you look at the scope of operation of Pegasus and you look at the operational law, and that's basically section 43 read by section 66 under the IT Act, which is essentially on unauthorized intrusions, or you look at even the provisions under the Telegraph Act or the Indian Penal Code, they deal with what is called as unauthorized interception. Okay. For us to then consider what Pegasus is, it's basically interception, which is essentially somebody eavesdropping on your conversation. But Pegasus is so much more. Pegasus is your ability to mine an active amount of data, even with respect to people when they're not talking on the phone. It has a functionality on switching on your recording device, even without you knowing it. It gathers, it's chilling. In fact, its functionality, which is described as per a leaked document, and that is a document from 2016. We don't know what advances have been made. For instance, Maya, it says that if two people who have been infected with Pegasus, let's say Siddharth and Venu meet, okay, then the recording function will switch on automatically, because that kind of conversation or even anything happening in their surrounding will be of interest. So the nature of the criminality goes much more beyond unauthorized access or unauthorized surveillance. The second element, and this is a crime, the second element which is very important to understand here is that NSO, which is the manufacturer of Pegasus, in its transparency report says it only sells it to the government or government or state actors. The second is, it also states that whenever such kind of agreements are entered, they are vetted by the Israeli Ministry of Defense. And in fact, a legal opinion to one of the private equity investors, which is pumping in money into NSO in about 2019, so that private equity investor could say that I'm investing in a legitimate enterprise and NSO is not an illegal entity. The lawyer actually advises what is the entire modus operandi here. It says that Pegasus is classified as a cyber weapon. It is the same as a missile which is exported by a private firm from Israel and needs an end user certificate and the contract to be vetted by the Israeli Ministry of Defense. Hence, NSO's claims, not with regard to several other things which it says, but at least with that it's only used, for instance, against terrorists in national security, but at least with regard to its sale being to a state entity has a degree of validity. Given this seriousness, it's not only a crime, it also requires an investigation which can possibly be ordered by a writ court. And for the government to state clearly on affidavit, beyond the responses they are given, firstly, either on the floor of the parliament through Mr. Vaishnav, in which he repeats a previous response by Ravi Shankar Prasad in 2019, which is ambiguous, not a yes or no. There is no unauthorized surveillance by the government of India. Unauthorized. So if it is authorized, they need to come forward and say whether they use these vague and outdated laws to do it. The second is, also to consider the response of the ad hominem which is being made, which is being referred so often. And I would just like to read it once because this is what it is. This is from our Home Minister's website, which says, people have often accused this phrase with me in a lighter vein, but today I want to say it seriously. The timing of the selective leaks, the disruptions. Aap chronology samjhiye. This is a report by the disruptors for the obstructors. So Siddharth, Wire, and possibly the people are disruptors. I am an obstructor. Disruptors are global organizations which do not like India to progress. Obstructors are political players in India who do not want India to progress. These are not the kind of responses we need today. The kind of responses we need today also can stem from the government's own investigation of the intelligence apparatus. It's not even ordered one inquiry. It is only giving bald denials. Now, considering this is a crime, one should ask the question, given that Indian citizens, people in high political establishment have been targeted, even sitting public officials such as an election commissioner may have been potentially targeted. Why hasn't the government ordered an investigation?
I wish I had an answer to your question, but I have a question, another question that might, give us some direction. Is it possible, and Apar, I guess you'd be the best person to answer this. Is it possible to try and legally get NSO to reveal who its clients are? Is there any scope for something like that?
So the process for this, which can be followed possibly and has not been done properly, has been a government to government interaction. The only thing which we have on record is a parliamentary response by Ravi Shankar Prasad when he was the Minister for Electronics and IT, stating that a letter was sent posing questions to WhatsApp and NSO group. This is in response to a parliamentary question in 2019. We don't know if a response was received. The second is the Standing Committee for IT may theoretically want to also summon people from NSO, but its proceedings have been disrupted. Also, if you look at legal processes, if a crime is registered, there are provisions under the MLAT process, in which a country can seek extradition of foreign nationals also potentially who have committed a crime extraterritorially. However, these are all long shots, I would say. I think the most the clear framework to approach this has to not be through placing a form of a criminal investigatory process with respect to foreign nationals. It has first to be establishing the degree of transparency of what actually potentially occurred. And secondly, then transparently disclosing that to cement public trust. And here, I do not think so. The government of India has engaged with Israel till date. So as Siddharth was explaining, France has already done so with Israel. And again, I leave us with a question, why have we not done it yet?
Right. Okay. I just to take that forward. In fact, one of the questions that's come in as well in the Q&A box, and this would go to both Praveen and Siddharth, or whichever one of you want to take it. Is it possible that Israel could use this as some leverage with the Indian government as well? Potential question. What would that leverage be and why?
Siddharth, do you want to take that?
Okay. I'll take a stab at that. That's an excellent question, because the very presence of this leaked database in the hands of our project, right? The Pegasus Project and Forbidden Stories and and its media partners indicates that at the very least, the metadata of stemming from the use of Pegasus in some shape or form by let's say India in this case exists in a server or a filing cabinet outside of the country. And the fact that India's data, along with Morocco and Mexico and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, in other words, 10 or 12 NSO clients, have all been recovered from the same place, would lead me or any reasonable person to believe that NSO itself has visibility on metadata at the very least. And I will add further that in response to certain pointed queries, which I guess NSO deemed to be so sensitive that they rushed to answer them. Was Pegasus used against Macron, for example? Within an hour and a half of the Guardian writing to them with a list of 14 heads of government, they said, we have checked records and we can confirm that Macron was not targeted. Now, how does a company which says it has no visibility on how its product is used, and that this is entirely, check, and that to check within an hour and a half, now even assuming that they are pally-pally with the Moroccans, right? Now, I'm sure many people in our audience who are from this community of intelligence people, they will testify as to how tetchy intelligence agencies can be to questions raised within their own country. Forget about from a foreigner, right?
Yeah.
Do we seriously expect RAW to get on the phone when NSO calls them to say, Sarji, did you target Rahul Gandhi or not? And that RAW will take that call and RAW will give an honest answer, right? So clearly, to my mind, either NSO is bluffing and just wanted to not deal with the huge crisis that Macron's targeting would reveal, or they have access to this data, who knows? But they have said in earlier cases too, even in the case of when Khashoggi was killed, the allegation then incidentally was not that Pegasus had been used directly, but Pegasus's name came up and the whole question of Saudis using it. They were very quick. NSO was very quick to issue a statement saying, we've looked at our records and the Saudis have not used Pegasus against Khashoggi. So they clearly have visibility, which leads me to the big question. In a worst case scenario, in a less than worst case scenario where they only have access to metadata, to my mind, that is bad enough. Because why would any government want a foreign government or a foreign agency to know that you are targeting a chief of somebody in your election commission, or that you're targeting your chief opposition rival? These are not things, dirty secrets that you want a foreign government to be aware of, right? And that's at the level of metadata. In the worst case scenario, if they actually have the real data, do you tomorrow, let's say Rahul Gandhi becomes prime minister, and the Israelis are sitting on 3 years of data from his phone. What does that do for a sovereign country like India? If whatever secrets he or anybody else has, which may be very personal, I mean, nothing that's illegal or whatever, but these personal secrets, right? Why on earth would any serious responsible state want to hand over this kind of data to a foreign power, right? Which is in all likelihood, there is this risk. So I think the question that the person has asked is a very valid question. We do learn from, I mean, as part of our reporting for the story, we had heard from sources kind of once removed. So this was not directly told to me. So we never used this in our reporting. But we were given to understand that there has been some reservation expressed within one of the intelligence agencies in India at the prospect of Indian information and data residing outside the country, and that this is not a good thing. I do believe that this reservation has been expressed, but brushed aside. So this is a problem.
Yeah. So Praveen, why don't you come in on that as well? Because it need not be only a politician's personal secrets that could be residing on the server, but also actual intelligence data that these agencies are trying to gather. That is, the property of another geography.
Right. Just to add to what Siddharth said, I mean, obviously, what you harvest from Rahul Gandhi's phone or anyone else's phone is a matter of great concern. And frankly, any Israeli intelligence service would be stupid to let such an opportunity pass, a free gift pass. But there's another issue there too, which is quite interesting, which is that India, for its needs for this kind of software, has had to go to a foreign company. Now, among NSO's list of clients, you don't see the United States or China or Russia or any significant country with its own cyber offensive capabilities. But what you do see in various investigations that have taken place, including by Citizen Lab, is that after that 2019 WhatsApp thing, some companies which were targeted by the Saudis, like Turkey, sort of rumbled onto this routine and became quite aggressive in their cyber defensive measures against NSO. And NSO is just one of many vendors selling this kind of equipment against those other vendors. We don't seem to have done anything like that. One of the interesting sort of side things is that even though so many Indian phones were infected from overseas, our own cyber authorities seem to have been completely blind to this. And this raises the interesting question, which foreign countries' cyber offensive services have managed to infect whose phones here? If somebody actually goes auditing the data, what will be found on the phone of top political or government officials? And this does sort of highlight some vulnerabilities, which when we went shopping for this stuff, we basically advertised to all and sundry saying, hey, we don't know how to look after ourselves. We need this stuff. But by the way, that should tell you we don't know how to defend ourselves against this stuff either. And that's genuinely worrying too, to my knowledge. If there is a thorough investigation tomorrow, what will it find out? The answers probably won't be great. And it all brings back again to the need for why we need some oversight and accountability for the entire intelligence community.
Right. So Apar, let me bring that back to you. We've only got a few more minutes, but a couple of questions that tie into this issue of oversight. One, of course, from somebody who's watching about, repeating why FIRs have not been lodged against who? NSO, the government of India. I don't know who they want to lodge the FIR against. That's one. But I think the larger question is that it's very clear that we have a structure and a system which is sort of operating in this extra constitutional sort of space, right? Where they're purchasing software, spyware, spying on citizens, the assumption being made. And what are the kind of, the motivations or the justifications for that decision is best known to them. However, it is not only being used for counterterrorism, it is not only being used for national security, and the chances that it's going to actually come to some sort of broader conversation where we can all sit around a table and agree, yes, this is wrong and we should not do it again, and we will learn from our past mistakes, is really I feel it's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and we're not even at on one side of it at this point in time. So how do we actually figure out checks and balances in an environment where there is a resistance to checks and balances?
So Maya, the first thing I'll like to indicate is that any process of surveillance reform, if we studied historically, has always been incremental. And the second thing is it's built of scandal. So possibly for people from my community who are hoping for surveillance reform, I'll say let there be 2 more scandals, because I know surveillance is happening in some unaccountable ways. So it's not like I'm wishing for illegality, but for it to be potentially disclosed. That's the first thing. The second is, what are the parallels? Let me just take a tangible parallel of somebody in high office engaging in what is called abuse of power as an offense, as defined in the United States. That is Richard Nixon, right? Comes out through the Watergate crisis. And in fact, it takes 2 years for investigations to be done, in which the US Supreme Court is involved, Department of Justice involved, as well as the Senate Judiciary Committee is involved. So you have all 3 arms of government looking at that issue at the same point in time. Now, I think we're reaching a similar moment here, but it will take many more possible exposures of what's happening. And I think it's only inevitable, given that Today, a lot of these technologies are being purchased globally. India won't possibly be the only vendor. They're also, the great thing about this kind of surveillance is it's not completely secret. And these secrets seep out because it does need an apparatus to be set up. For instance, even for Pegasus, if one looks at the annexure to the contracts which they executed with Ghana, they need a physical presence in the country to install a server, and they also provide technicians who come and set this up. So there will always be trails. I think we will move towards reform, but it will take many more possibly parliamentary disruptions, many more batch matters with many more senior advocates, and a lot of more front page stories about this. Now, ultimately, I think what is the important point here has been highlighted by Siddharth, has been, when does this surveillance start? It starts sometime in 2017, as per our estimation. What is happening at that point in time? We are also entering a phase in which we are looking towards a very crucial national election, which will be in 2019. The basis of elections is free and fair, which is essentially political candidates being able to compete. We know that's distorted because of money, but what's a greater distortion to that is when you get to know your opponent's strategy, you get to know what they're doing in advance. And you also get to know information about what they are thinking and potentially also using it and weaponizing it against them. And I'm not making these remarks without the basis of fact, because it does not only concern the top political establishment as to the names which have been revealed, but also reveals the name of a chief election commissioner. I think this is serious. And I think the more we talk about it, the more these kind of panels are done, but the more reporting is done ultimately. We will reach a point where we will tip over, but we'll take all arms of government because it's a big problem with several blocks to address.
Right. Okay. Well, I'll leave final comments to Siddharth, but before that, I want to just apologize to one of our participants who asked a question about the sort of Android versus Apple conversation when it comes to Pegasus. I haven't posed it to any of the panelists because I don't think any of the three of them are technologically the right people to answer this question. I'll leave it to Praveen, Siddharth, Apar, if any of you want to have a bash, because there seems to be curiosity about, why is Android safer than Apple, or is Android safer than Apple? Anyone want to go for that or stand back?
Look, I wouldn't say that one is safer than the other. People have drawn that conclusion based on what we say, that the forensic tests are easier to perform on an iPhone. But you could turn that argument around to say, well, if it's easier to detect Pegasus on an iPhone, this means you can get rid of it, right? Or you can protect yourself. So maybe this means iPhone is more safe. I don't know. Frankly, I think both phones are vulnerable. If you do have an iPhone, the advice that we got given by Amnesty and that I gave, our reporters gave to everybody on our list who had an iPhone was make sure you toggle FaceTime and iMessage off, because both are vectors for infection and for activation of certain features of Pegasus if Pegasus is on your phone. But at the end of the day, I think it's important, whether we're journalists or lawyers or anybody, like, we should be sensible about how we use technology. We should be aware of the risks, but we have to live our lives, and you can't let people, small men with undemocratic aims, change the way that we lead our lives. So the work that we do is important. We have to find ways to do it, but we should be sensible, right? So don't take unnecessary risks. If there's something that is confidential, be aware that a physical meeting is perhaps the best form of communicating that, and keep your phones away from that meeting if you're worried.
The Faraday bag is the sort of
Exactly.
piece of equipment you need to carry to keep your phone away, have conversations face to face. But that's a great note to end this discussion on. Siddharth, Praveen, Apar, all three of you, thanks so much for speaking so candidly, and thank you to the BIC for hosting all of us in this conversation. Lekha, I'll hand it back to you.
If you are pondering the mythical question of whether horses fly, it seems based on today's discussion that maybe they do. It's unfortunate that an invasive tool could have possibly grown wings in India, and it's wishful thinking to hope that better sense prevails, worthy of a robust democracy. Alas, if only wishes were horses. Only remains to be seen how much longer the wax holds up to a searing gaze of truth. Thank you, Siddharth, Praveen, Apar, for your time and your expert inputs. Thank you, Maya, for being an excellent interlocutor as always. Thank you, audiences, for joining us today. This coming weekend, we have quite a lineup: a discussion on Girish Karnar's memoir, The Man with a Story and a Song, a discussion with Dr. Raghunath Mashelkar and Janvi Phalke, and a conversation with Zakir Hussain and T.M. Krishna. All on our BIC platform. Do take a look at our website and our social media platforms for more information, and hope to see you at one of these events. Thank you, everyone. Good evening, and see you next time.
Thank you so much, Maya.